How about if we get started? I'm going to see if I can share the screen. Okay, as we mentioned, this is going to be the 10th webinar, and essentially it's going to be the final webinar of the course. So this is what we've gone through, and we've used the book to go through all the chapters. Well, we covered as much as possible. I'm sure that we didn't cover 100% of everything in the textbook, but that's why the book is there. Sometimes I make reference to it as a textbook, but it's more like a handbook or a reference book. And so this is what we're going to concentrate on: integrative models of well-being. And these are the integrative models that I selected to focus on. As a matter of fact, there's this one in the book, which is The Joyless Economy by Tibor Skytowski, if I'm pronouncing it right. I decided not to cover that. And the reason being is because the more I think about it, the more I realize that it's not as integrative as some of the other models, and therefore the next edition of the book, I'm going to place it in the chapter dealing with income, because in essence, the theory focuses very much on explaining the effect of income on well-being or happiness. So we're going to focus on livability theory, capability theory, stocks and flows, quality of the person plus the environment, homeostatically protected mood, quality of life, which is a function of happiness, life satisfaction, and absence of well-being, the bi-directional spillover model, the psychology of personal projects, the psychology of quality of life, and positive balance. So these, I feel that they are integrative enough that they don't necessarily focus on a specific phenomena, but they are designed to kind of integrate a bunch of different concepts. Now, of course, there are other integrative models that I did not, we're not going to get a chance to talk about. And since Michael Frisch is with us, he has definitely an integrative model in his quality of life therapy book. It is integrative, but it focuses very much on quality of life therapy. So if you're interested in his ideas, I'm sure that you let me know, and I'll let you have a good reference.
Thanks for the plug.
You're very welcome, Mike. Okay, well, let's start out with what you might call livability theory. I'm going to expand. Yeah, there we go. Livability theory. Now, the person that is responsible for livability theory is Ruut Veenhoven. He is a sociologist, and he's been at Erasmus University, and probably many of you know about him from his World Happiness database. He's got this huge database that he has developed over the years, and he's written so much about happiness. So he developed this livability theory, and it is integrative in the sense that it focuses on understanding how these three things at the bottom, as you see, the societal resources, personal resources, and individual abilities contribute to happiness, and in what way does that? So, you know, many of the theories that we have in the psychology of well-being focuses on just one or the other, or they tend to be a little bit much more micro. So livability theory says, okay, well, when it comes to happiness, there's so many things that influence happiness, and societal resources, personal resources, and individual abilities tend to play a major role. So what do we mean by, let's say, societal resources? Societal resources would be things like economic. If a country has an economic, a welfare system, for example, if a country has societal resources in terms of a justice system, a social justice system that ensures social equality, for example, equality between, for example, males and females. So we're talking about gender equality, equality in terms of distribution of wealth, in terms of progressive taxation, on and on, political freedom as in democracy. Again, these are societal resources that contribute, again, to happiness. And we'll talk about how these things do contribute to happiness through life chances, course of events, and flow of experience. We'll get to that once we describe these others. So when we're dealing with personal resources, these are things that a person brings to the table, so to speak. So, personal resources would be things like a social position. If a person has a higher social position in society, then that is a resource that the person uses, and it contributes to a personal happiness. Material possessions, for example, income and material possessions also tend to contribute to happiness, again, and they're considered to be what you might call personal resources. So people use all kinds of resources. Political influence, for example, is a personal resource, and one can use that resource in order to enhance one's sense of well-being. Family ties is another way, another personal resource that seems to be quite significant, and people use, that to increase opportunities in life that would allow them to experience happiness. Then we have individual abilities. Now, individual abilities are things that seems to be intrinsic in people. Like, for example, a person's personality, self-esteem, for example, is self-efficacy. These internal locus of control. These are personality traits that the person brings to the table and ultimately makes quite a difference in personals, in happiness. Of course, the most important one that we are all very, very much aware of is positive affectivity in the sense that, a person through some sort of possibly genetic makeup, a person has a positive disposition, and it is cross-situational in the sense that whatever situation that the person finds himself or herself in, again, brings in a certain amount of happiness to that situation. Life chances are essentially opportunities. So these things, societal resources, personal resources, individual abilities, create those opportunities that that translate in terms of course of events. Course of events, and that is, these would be a series of events that tend to be favorable or unfavorable to the person's happiness. Veenhoven talks about course of events would be things like, and I'm reading from the book, some people tend to run into trouble a lot, while others find themselves to stay out of trouble. That's a sort of a course of event. Some people experience accidents. Some do not. Some are laid off from their jobs. Some run into wonderful opportunities that make them promoted real fast. Some stay healthy while others become sick. So what you see is that these opportunities that are, in essence, what you might call life chances, translate or become course of events that lead to a flow of experience. And these experiences can be positive or negative. Now, of course, the positive flow of experiences tend to contribute to happiness, much more so than, of course, a negative flow. A negative flow would detract from happiness. So that is, in essence, the gist of the theory, livability theory. And I've seen it used in so many contexts to explain so many well-being findings. That's why I think it is integrative, because, again, of its integrative nature, right? Do you have any questions about that? Let's see. Take the chat box and put it right next door so I can see you if you're going to put any comments in the chat box. Okay, let's. Yes, Mike.
It's a simplified and it's a beautiful theory.
Right. It's very parsimonious. Parsimonious and comprehensive in the same time. Okay, capability theory. Capability theory is a theory that, again, a lot of well-being researchers, quality of life researchers have used over the years, and it is generated by a Nobel laureate, Amartya Sen. He's an economist per se, and he, a lot of people think that, not believe. He is, in essence, the founder of the Human Development Index of the United Nations Development Program. And if you're familiar with the Human Development Index, it is most commonly used by, of course, not only the United Nations, but so many well-being researchers to compare the level of quality of life between and among nations. And so the theory is literally, the capability theory is the foundation of the Human Development Index, and much research that is tangential to the Human Development Index. So what is capability theory? So Amartya Sen talks about that we function on a daily basis. What do? We function in daily life, and we experience all kinds of feelings as a function of those functioning. Excuse the pun. So we do a lot of things, and we are a lot of things, and that's ultimately, you can capture that as the outcome of capabilities. In order to feel happy, in order to have a higher quality of life in terms of good level of functioning, you have to have certain capabilities. And capability is able to parsimoniously capture capability in terms of 3 dimensions. And that is health, income, and education. So health, to capture health, again, the Human Development Index uses life expectancy as a major indicator capturing health. So a society that has a higher level of life expectancy, that is an indicator of capability, that the society is more capable of reaching a higher level of well-being than those that are sort of afflicted with poor health. So if you have a problem where, you know, a significant segment of the population tends to be sick or chronically sick, then of course that dampens the possibility or the likelihood that the society can achieve a higher level of well-being or quality of life. So health is so fundamental to well-being or quality of life. And therefore, it is a major capability dimension. Another capability dimension is income. You know, you need to have resources, financial resources, economic resources, in order to allow for development, economic development. Economic development is very foundational to what you might call social development. If you don't have economic development, you have very little social development. One is based on the other. So in terms of income, again, the Human Development Index captures that dimension of capability in terms of GDP, gross national GDP, gross domestic product. Again, this is an economic dimension that is used at the national level. And there are variations of GDP, for example, GDP per capita, by taking into account the size of the population of the country, for example. So again, measures of income, wealth is a prerequisite to good functioning and therefore quality of life. Education is so fundamental too. It is a form of capability. A society that has a significant segment of its population not educated, it's not likely to develop economically. And of course, without a good level of economic development, you don't have good level of social development. As we mentioned, social development is mostly based on economic development. So education is also a fundamental capability, in the sense that if you don't have education, you don't have a population that is capable of engaging in the kinds of things that would make society tick, that make society productive, right? So education is so fundamental. And when we're talking about education, we're not talking about higher education. We're talking about all levels of education, including a certain level of literacy, in the sense that, again, people have to read and write. A population that has a significant segment that cannot even read and write. For example, when you read something like the side effects of a prescription drug, well, you really have a problem there, right? So a basic level of literacy plus primary, secondary education, and of course, trade education or possibly higher education are so fundamental to economic development. So that's capability theory. And I've seen it used in so many different contexts, but mostly by happiness economists. Yes. Do you have any questions about that? Okay. Stocks and flow. Stocks and flow is a theory developed by Bruce Headey. Bruce Headey is a social psychologist in Australia. And he has written so much about this particular thing. And I love this theory because it is grounded in a metaphor. And the metaphor is, well, we all have sort of an accounting frame of mind, in the sense that we try and monitor our wealth, so to speak, or income, savings, what have you, in terms of what you call a balance sheet, and cash flow. So a balance sheet has three dimensions in it. We've got assets, we've got liabilities, and we got net worth, right? So you take assets and you subtract from the assets liabilities, and you end up with your net financial worth, right? That's the gist of a balance sheet. On the other hand, you have on a daily basis, if you're running a household or you're running a business, you have to have a cash flow statement. So you have to have some sort of an accounting system that allows you to keep track of the ins and out, the inflows and cash outflows. So you translate the concept of cash flow, and you translate the concept of a balance sheet. The balance sheet is essentially stock. So people have a stock. They have stocks. Stocks are things that they bring to the table in a consistently. So as you can see, stock as in terms of a balance sheet, you can actually think of stocks as in terms of assets, strength of one's personality. So when we talk about things like self-esteem, when we talk about positive affectivity, when we're talking about self-efficacy, when we're talking about optimism, again, these are traits, personality traits that are that denote a personality that is strong, that is likely to contribute to happiness, contribute to well-being. Then, of course, we have things that you bring to the table as in health, personal health. If you're a healthy person, then again, that is a factor, a significant factor that contributes to one's happiness. Social networks, if you have a good, substantial social network, a network of people that you interact with that provide you with social support, that is something that is what you might call a stock. It's something that is stable, that you bring to the table, and it contributes to your sense of well-being. Leisure skills. If you play golf, or you play tennis, or you play racquetball, or you have a set of leisure skills that you put them to the test, so to speak. These are the kinds of things that do contribute to the sense of well-being. And remember the theory that we talked about in terms of flow. When you engage in a leisure activity and you experience this flow experience, this flow that gets you so absorbed with the activity. Well, this flow experience comes from being able to master the leisure activity. You become totally absorbed with the leisure activity and you feel a sense of flow. Well, and then that contributes to a sense of well-being. So again, for those people who have mastered a level of leisure activity, leisure or recreational or sports activity, for example, again, that is a stock that is a plus to one's well-being. Equipment, education, socioeconomic status, you get the gist of it, right? It's if you have the equipment, the material possession that would allow you to, the kinds of resources that would allow you to convert them into, positive experiences. Now, these are the kinds of things that, contribute to happiness. Education, of course, is very self-explanatory, because without education, you cannot achieve life goals. important life goals. Socioeconomic status, if you're born of the sort of what you call an upper middle class or upper class, then you've got a leg up, so to speak, on happiness. That's different from flows, what you experience on a daily basis, what you call the daily hassles and the daily uplifts, hassles and uplifts. These are essentially cash flow. Well, not cash, but there are flows in the sense that, you know, they fluctuate on a daily basis. So one day you run into a friend and that friend, would praise you for, for something that you've done, maybe for a promotion, and that all of a sudden you have a good mood for the rest of the day. That's what you call an uplift, right? An uplift. That's part of a flow. So flows, as you've seen from the slide, satisfaction experience in daily activities in different life domains, such as financial life, social life, family life, work life, and so forth. So you put those two together, right? You've got the stocks and you've got the flows, and both stocks and flows tend to contribute to happiness. Just in the same way that, for example, Ruut Veenhoven talked about personal resources and societal resources, as well as individual abilities. But again, it's a sort of a different language. It's a different language. So we're talking about the same thing, almost, but again, using different terminology. Okay, no questions so far. So we'll move on. Paul Lane. Paul Lane is a political psychologist. He has been deceased for a while now, but over the years, he's written a bunch of things in the psychology of well-being that covers political economy as well as subjective well-being. So he goes from the very macro to the very micro. And in his last book, which is called The Market Experience, I think, he came up with this model that allows some sort of an integration of a whole bunch of psychological concepts. Talk about the other slide, which is, you notice in that slide that both of them interact. So both of them are reciprocally, they influence each other in a reciprocal manner. So this is the stocks affect the flows and flows affect the stocks. And that's pretty obvious. It's pretty self-explanatory. If you need me to further explain, just ask. And the same thing is, again, in terms of what Paul Lane has come up with, and that is the quality of the person versus the quality of the environment. Both of these things tend to integrate and ultimately affect the quality of life of a person. So the quality of the person, he was able to break it down in terms of very specific dimensions based on a good comprehensive review of the literature back then. Capacity for enjoying life, cognitive complexity, sense of autonomy and effectiveness, self-knowledge, self-esteem, ease of interpersonal relations, ethical orientation, personality integration, productive orientation. Let's see if we explain those. Capacity for enjoying life. Let's say, if you're a pessimist, I would say that pessimists have a lower or lesser capacity to enjoy life. If a person is chronically depressed or clinically depressed, that person is very likely to have a have lower capacity to enjoy life. So there are many psychological traits. Again, neuroticism, for example, is another personality trait that really takes away from the capacity to enjoy life. Because people who are high on neuroticism, high on depression, high on anxiety, high on pessimism, they tend to look at the world and at themselves and at their own experience in a negative frame of mind. And when you have a negative frame of mind and you appraise almost most of the situations that you experience in through this negative frame of mind, that takes away from your sense of well-being. Cognitive complexity. Cognitive complexity is the opposite of dogmatism. What is a dogmatic person? A dogmatic person is a person who sees things in black or white. A person who sees things in black or white is usually a person who has tunnel vision. And actually, many of us, well, I would venture to say most of us, tend to try and appraise the world, try to assess and make sense of the world by categorizing things. It's either good or bad. It's either black or white, right? It's happy or sad. But reality, the world, is full of shades of gray, right? And a person who would tend to interpret and appraise all kinds of events as either good or bad are likely to interpret events more bad than good. And therefore, being dogmatic tends to not contribute to happiness as much as being open-minded to the point where you see reality in all its complexities, right? That is definitely a positive attribute. Sense of autonomy and effectiveness. If you feel like you have control over your own destiny, that is definitely a major personality trait that is positive, that feeds into your sense of well-being. Because one of the things that's so important about autonomy and effectiveness is that you remember the stuff that we talked about in terms of cognition. You attribute those positive events to yourself. You are responsible. You claim ownership to those events. And if you claim ownership, that you give yourself credit. And if you give yourself credit for the positive events, for those successes in life, then that boosts not only your self-esteem, but your overall sense of well-being. Ease of interpersonal relation. We talked about how interpersonal relationship or social network or social support is what you call social capital. And social capital is definitely a very important attribute to the sense of well-being. Ethical orientation. If you're not ethical, it's very likely that you will make the kinds of mistakes in life, that you will do things in life that will haunt you, that will what goes around comes around. If you step on toes, your toe will be stepped on eventually, sooner or later, that kind of thing. So being ethical is definitely a plus, in feeding your sense of self, your sense of well-being. Personality integration, that's an interesting psychological concept too. I guess I tend to think of psychological integration. If you appreciate, or if you have an understanding of psychopathology and you talk about personality disintegration, a person having literally a nervous breakdown is the kind of person that has so many psychological contradictions, experiences so much what you might call cognitive dissonance, have multiple personalities. That these are indicators of what you might call personality integration. Mike, can you chip in? Mike is a clinical psychologist. Mute.
Yeah, so you're doing fine.
Oh, thank you. Validation. Well, okay, Mike. Productive orientation. Productive orientation, definitely from the point of view of being productive, from being able to set, life goals and being able to accomplish those goals, especially in a community or a societal context, would give you the kinds of rewards that translate into a greater sense of well-being. So according to Paul Lane, these are probably the most important aspects of the person. He calls them the quality dimensions of a person. So those quality dimensions interact, as you can see, the reciprocal thing, interact with the quality of the environment. And as you can see, same thing with the stocks and flows, the same thing with capability, the same thing with livability. We're almost talking about almost the same thing, but again, different languages. But according to Paul Lane, the things that are so important to the environment that feeds to a person, which we'll call personal happiness, would be things like adequate material support, physical safety and security, available friends and social support, opportunities for the expression and receipt of love, opportunities for intrinsically challenging work, leisure opportunities, leisure opportunities that have elements of skill, creativity, and relaxation, available set of moral values that can give meaning to life, opportunities for self-development, justice system managed by a disinterested and competent parties, so that you take out corruption from the justice system. These are, again, environmental conditions. And if you have a society that have these qualities, then you have the basis that would allow the person to experience happiness, bring in jointly those quality of the person, then you've got a wonderful recipe. Think of it in terms of a recipe. Yeah, that's a sort of a nice metaphor. A food recipe. No questions? Okay. Here we have Robert Cummins, recently retired from Deakin University of Australia. He has written so much about the homeostatically protected mood. Homeostatically protected mood. So he's done considerable amount of research dealing with the concept of life satisfaction. And based on the massive amount of data that he has developed over the years, he finds from those surveys is that life satisfaction ratings is very stable over time. Remember the stuff that we talked about in terms of set point? He talks about life satisfaction as essentially having some sort of an adaptation level, a set point. And that set point for the majority of people tends to be sort of moderately, if on a scale from 1 to 100, it's around 75. So it's, most people experience moderate level of happiness, moderate level of life satisfaction. But they, on a daily basis, life satisfaction fluctuates, but it fluctuates, according to his analysis, within a range of 3.1 percentage point. So if we're talking about 75 on a scale from 0 to 100, then we're looking at fluctuation within the 70s, right? Mostly. So you can go to the low 70s and the high 70s, but it's, on the average, it's around 75. So people use life satisfaction as a set point. They have a set point, and deviations. So if they encounter a life event that would make them feel bad, that would be sort of a negative deviation from life satisfaction, from the adaptation level or the set point of life satisfaction. Then it is a situation that warrants corrective action, just like a thermostat. A thermostat it monitors the temperature in the room, right? If there is a positive or negative deviation, if you're setting the thermostat to something like 32 degrees Celsius, and then if the room becomes too warm, the air conditioner comes on, that in essence prompts corrective action. Well, the same thing with our bodies, for example. Our bodies function through some sort of a control system to achieve homeostasis. And deviation from that reference point, that set point, causes the person or the physical apparatus or the biological organ or the psychological organ, for that matter, to restore homeostatic balance. So what we do is we engage in action to restore a set point of life satisfaction, right? So Cummins talks about what do we do in life as that would ensure that we would go back to that set point. Unfortunately, most of his writings focus on what you call negative deviations. So if you have a set point, he talks about what happens if you run into a situation or you have an experience that deviates from your set point. That's a negative deviation. He rarely talks about positive deviation, but he makes mention that it doesn't matter whether it's positive or negative. If it is a deviation from that set point, that would trigger corrective action. And people come back to that set point, right? So, wait a minute, but a positive deviation is a good thing. Let's say, for example, like if you consume a product and you have a certain level of expectation of the quality of the product, if it exceeds your expectation, you should feel pretty good about it. And from an organizational point of view, that's what marketers do. They try to exceed customer satisfaction, which is definitely a good thing. But Cummins doesn't really address positive deviations as much. He believes that even with positive deviations, people come back to their set point. Yeah, I'd say yes or no. Yes, there is a tendency to go back to the set point, but if you have too many positive deviations, your set point adapts and increases. It heightens. But he doesn't address that much. He talks about, again, negative deviations and what are those buffers that people use in order to bring about, to restore homeostatic balance. So he talks about external and internal buffers. External buffers would be things like wealth and relationships. If you have enough financial resources, you can deal with a whole bunch of different negative life events. All you need to do is just go and get some sort of a service or buy whatever product that would help you, again, feel better, right? That would be wealth. But relationships too, in terms of social capital, allows you to, again, use that as a buffer to restore a negative deviation to a set point, right? Restore homeostatic balance. And the same thing with these are external buffers. Internal buffers would be things where now he acknowledges that the set point can move. So in essence, just as I mentioned, if you experience too many positive deviations, then it's very likely that the set point would move up. The same thing happens if you experience too many negative deviations. You habituate, you adapt to the reality of the environment. Let's say if you're a teenager and you mature, and with greater maturity, you become realistic in terms of your expectations, and your expectations become dampened. Oh, you want to become a movie star. Okay. You go to Hollywood, and guess what? You have a reality check, and your expectations become dampened. So adaptation and habituation are, which you might call internal buffers, in which the set point can move up or down, and therefore accommodate reality, accommodate the environment. But again, unfortunately, Cummins focuses much on the negative deviations and negative adaptations and habituation and so forth, and doesn't really address what. And as a matter of fact, the latter point, which is the last bullet on the slide, he talks a lot about depression. Depression occurs as an outcome of chronic and strong life events in which the internal and external buffers fail to restore homeostasis, right? So those internal and external buffers fail, and therefore, people experience the onset of depression. And depression, of course, is the ultimate opposite of happiness. No questions?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
I just wondered whether, so the set point that's sort of estimated at being around 75, presumably that's in relation to adults of a particular age. Does he say much about children in this? Because children would generally be known to have slightly higher levels of life satisfaction.
That's true. That's, yeah, in the context of demographics, when we talked about age, we talked about the research that shows that there is a U-shaped relationship in the sense that children and teenagers tend to experience higher level of well-being, happiness, and then when it comes to adults, that kind of dips in middle adulthood, so to speak, but then in later adulthood, when people retire and experience much more leisure, but then of course it dips back in old age, very old age, when health takes a toll on people. But you're right, when it comes to children, they experience a higher level of well-being, and but his surveys have focused very much on adults. So that 75 average is a reflection of an adult population. So I would assume it would be a little higher. So it would probably be in the range of maybe in the 80s, mid 80s. Does that make sense, Larissa?
I'm also intrigued by the idea of the taking sort of corrective action to restore homeostasis, and whether that, that's also believed within this theory to apply to children as well. But I mean, I should probably look up Cummins' work to find out more about what he says about children.
Yeah, I mean, his ideas are set as a sort of a universal phenomenon that would apply to all people, whether they're children or elderly people or adults. So I don't have any doubt in my mind that it applies to children too. Yeah, but yeah, you certainly, you may want, if you want to use his theory, you may want to check his writing a little bit more closely. Yes, I know that he's written a lot about disabled people too, but I'm not 100% sure whether his research dealt with children per se. Yeah. Okay, well, how about if we take a 10-minute break and come back, and then we will continue to talk about Michael Argyle's ideas, and then some of the other models. And I think we will be able to finish what we're supposed to be finishing today. Okay, let's take a 10-minute break. See you in 10 minutes. Okay. Well, we're reconvening. Okay, the next model that we're going to be talking about is Michael Argyle, who's a social psychologist, British. Written so much about happiness and again, the psychology of well-being. And he came up with his own integrative model, and it makes a lot of sense. And the idea is pretty simple, and that is quality of life, in his view, is long-term happiness and life satisfaction accompanied with absence of ill-being, absence of well-being. So You need to feel happy long term. You need to feel satisfied with life. And you need to experience absence of ill-being. Now, what is absence of ill-being? This is a little bit problematic. Well, I wouldn't say problematic. Maybe that's not the right word. Because, again, it really gets into aspects of psychopathology and health. But it's mostly about psychopathology. And his vantage point is that if you have a significant or major psychopathological condition, such as clinical depression, for example, or maybe something like schizophrenia, or a bipolar disorder, or one of those, then it's very difficult for the person to experience a high quality of life. So that's absence of ill-being. So that is one of his, what you might call, prerequisite. So prerequisite is absence of ill-being. Life satisfaction is important, and that is, in order to experience a high level of quality of life, again, the person has to make a judgment that his or her life, again, is optimal. And then happiness long-term. Now, again, he gets into what happiness long-term is, in essence, captured by a whole bunch of short-term happiness. So if you think in terms of happiness as in terms of positive and negative affect that is associated with events, with life events, then that contributes to short-term happiness. But then if you experience, so many of those events long-term, and therefore you experience a whole bunch of happiness in the long run, that translates into what you might call long-term happiness. If Michael Argyle's definition, or actually conceptualization of quality of life, was a turning point for Ed Diener. Ed Diener, he came up with a sort of an umbrella definition of subjective well-being, which is very much based on this. And a lot of people have embraced Ed Diener's definition of subjective well-being, which in essence based on positive and negative affect, although he doesn't necessarily restrict positive and negative affect to what you might call long-term, as in long-term happiness. He talks about Ed Diener and his colleagues have addressed positive and negative affect in the context of very specific situations, as well as long-term. So he didn't necessarily make that distinction, but Argyle made that distinction very explicitly. Okay, so it's a simple model. It allows you to, again, bring in a bunch of different concepts that have sort of integrated in a way to give you an understanding of how quality of life, and in this case, perceived quality of life, tends to be determined by these other concepts. The bi-directional spillover model has been addressed by a bunch of different people. Mallard is one of them, but you might be familiar with Alex Mikolos. Alex Mikolos is one of the people that addressed that have developed this model, or at least contributed to the development of this model. And Alex Michaelis is, again, one of the sort of the founders of the social indicators movement. And remember all this discussion that we had in terms of the bottom-up spillover and the top-down spillover? Well, this model is designed to bring in those elements. So again, when we're talking about global personality dimensions, that's a sort of a top-down spillover. So the top-down spillover, and that is, a personality trait like a positive affectivity or self-esteem or self-confidence or optimism. These are essentially personality traits that from a top down, they influence domain satisfaction. So as you can see from that arrow, top down is global personality dimensions affecting interpretation of life circumstances. And the example would be, for example, the interpretation of health. A person who has maybe a positive disposition, has positive affectivity, is likely to rate his or her health as much higher or much more positive than, again, a person who has a lower level of positive affectivity, or positive, in this case, it would be negative affectivity. And the interpretation of those life events, in the end, affect subjective well-being, as in life satisfaction, as in positive negative affect, as in happiness, as in absence of ill-being, yes. And then you have those objective life circumstances that affect, these are the objective circumstances that affect domains. So again, remember, bottom up. So what affects those life events in terms of the objective reality play an imminent or a prominent role in domain satisfaction, and domain satisfaction spills over onto life satisfaction through the interpretation of those life circumstances. So this is bi-directional in the sense that it brings in elements of the top down and the bottom up into one model. And that's why we call it integrative, because it integrates two disparate types of concepts. This particular model, which is called personal projects, is more of a recent model, but I've seen it cited in a bunch of times. So I thought maybe I'll bring it in and talk about it in that context, because it addresses, as you can see, human flourishing at the bottom of the slide, encompasses hedonic well-being, which is life satisfaction, positive and negative affect, eudaimonic well-being, as in meaning, self-expression, virtue, and stuff, physical health and energy, domain satisfaction, as we talked about in terms of satisfaction with work life, satisfaction with family life, and so forth. And then the impact on the ecosystem in terms of accomplishments and generality. So it's really an all-encompassing kind of a theory that's supposed to explain a whole lot. And it explains a whole lot through this idea of personal projects. Personal projects. By the way, the authors is Ryan Little and his colleagues. So what is personal project? Personal project is literally everything that we do involves some sort of a personal project. You can think of personal projects as macro, as in I have a personal project of getting myself educated. I have a personal project of getting certified, through maybe a course like this. I have a personal project of taking my car to to the garage to get it, let's say, to get it serviced and repaired. So again, it can vary from the very micro to the very macro. So if you think in terms of those personal projects, you know, the experience that you end up from those personal projects, you know, would affect human flourishing, as in terms of hedonic well-being. So, you know, if you're taking your car to the garage to get it repaired, what would be the experience resulting from this project? It can be positive or negative affect. It could be eudaimonic in the sense that you learn something new about if car repair is something that is very important to you, it would instill a sense of eudaimonia in you. It's very meaningful and so forth. On and on to some of the other dimensions. But personal projects are affected by personality aspects, you know, as in terms of the stable person features. Again, we're talking about dispositional traits that the person brings to the table, as well as what's in the environment. And these on a very granular level translate in terms of dynamic aspects that dynamic person aspects, like for example, dynamic person features, free traits, role enactments. These are translated from the personality traits in a specific context, a specific situational context that affect the person's personal project. And that, of course, interfaces with the environment. And again, in the context of the environment, there are stable features in the environment in terms of norms and the physical space and what else that is converted into dynamic aspects of the environment in terms of the personal context and so forth. And that affects the personal project and the experience that the person has within that project that affects those dimensions of human flourishing. Ooh, that was a mouthful. But that's the gist of it. I personally need to go back and read a lot more so that I'd feel 100% comfortable with it. But it's been cited a lot. So I thought I'd bring it in. Aha.
Uh-huh.
Now, this, the surgery business here, the psychology of quantum, I put together a book. Actually, the first edition of this book was more of a theory rather than a literature review kind of a book. And it's essentially based on my own ideas. That was back in 20 years ago. And it's been cited a lot, so I thought I'd bring it in. And the idea is that, well, I was able to put together a bunch of concepts together in an integrative, holistic manner. And the way I defined subjective quality of life, or subjective well-being, if you may, is that it's satisfaction of developmental needs through participation in salient life domains that are reflected in value-laden beliefs about the totality of life, which is life satisfaction. When a person is making a judgment about the totality of life, that is a life satisfaction judgment. And it is very much driven by need satisfaction that ultimately contribute to domain satisfaction. So developmental needs are satisfied through activities organized in terms of life domains, and domain satisfaction determines life satisfaction. So far, so good. Now, the second principle that I emphasize over and over again in the book is the fact that we don't try to maximize life satisfaction. We optimize, just in the same way that, for example, Cummins talks about as an adaptation level. We find in some sort of an acceptable level of life satisfaction at an adaptation level, and we try to maintain it in the best way we can. We don't maximize it to 100%, but we try and maintain. And just as Cummins talks about, that adaptation level with that set point is optimized rather than maximized. In the psychology of decision-making literature, there's a concept which is called satisficing, not satisficing, satisfying, and that is people make decisions not necessarily to optimize their pleasures and minimize their pains. They do it in a way to be, people are cognitively miserly. So they are misers, so to speak, in the sense that we don't try to spend physical and mental energy in order to maximize satisfaction. We optimize, we satisfice, that's the word, and that's exactly what we do when it comes to life satisfaction. And then I talk about, I'm running out of time, optimize life satisfaction. We do this through a variety of strategies, cognitive, affective types of strategies, behavioral strategies, so to speak. I call them inter-domain strategies and intra-domain strategies. And we already talked about those strategies. That's why the theory is integrative. And that is bottom-up spillover, top-down spillover, horizontal spillover. These are not fait accompli. People can actually manipulate things in their head, in their mind, to optimize their level of life satisfaction. And I talk about how they do this, how they optimize life satisfaction by manipulating certain aspects, the cognitive calculus that is involved in bottom-up spillover, the top-down spillover, and the horizontal spillover. So you can read a little bit more about how those are, in essence, translated into cognitive and affective strategies. Intra-domain, within each domain, people also do a whole bunch of things in order to optimize, their domain satisfaction. And they do this through reevaluation based on personal history, reevaluation based on self-concept, reevaluation based on social comparison, goal selection, goal implementation and attainment, reappraisal, and balance within the domain rather than inter-domain. So because we're out of time, read it in the book, and if you have any questions about it, then you just send me an email and I'll respond. Well, of course, we're not going to have a chance to talk about this last one. This is, of course, unbiased, and this is based on my recent book on positive balance. We already talked about that in the context of defining well-being or subjective well-being specifically in terms of its different hierarchy from the physiological level all the way through emotional, cognitive, metacognitive, developmental, and socio-ecological level. But the thing that is integrative and that I wanted to talk about it, but you can get the gist of it by reading it in table 29.2, and in that table on 704 and 705 and 706, there is an explanation of what we call the emergence. So you see that slide? How does, for example, the neurotransmitter contribute to the development of positive and negative affect? And it does that through an emergent process, which is called cognitive appraisal. The same thing can be said in terms of how domain, for example, positive and negative affect contribute to domain satisfaction. And it does that through, again, a process that we call domain segmentation. And the same thing can be said in terms of how domain satisfaction contributes to life satisfaction, and it does that through a bottom-up process, and how life satisfaction interacts with personal growth and the psychology related with personal growth. Like, for example, we talked about Erickson's ideas in developing eudaimonia, and how eudaimonia interacts with our understanding of social and moral development to produce socio-eudaimonia, that kind of thing. So it's all on the table, and I'll leave it at that. Oh my goodness, I'm always running out of time. And I apologize for that. Again, we're a couple of minutes over time. So again, this is the end. So I hope you got something positive out of this, out of this whole course, or maybe bits and pieces out of the different webinars. I will send you, for those who are getting certified, I'll send you the exam questions. And for the rest of you, I thank you for participating, and I bid you farewell.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sergi.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Joe. Very nice.
Thank you. Okay,
Thank you so
It's a
much.
great course.
bye-bye.
Learned a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.